Hello, everybody. My name's Ian. Today, I'm going to be talking about this destructive addition illustration. This particular piece is being done in Clip Studio Paint on my PC using my Huion Kamvas Pro 16 2.5K, drawing and painting with a stylus. The dimensions of the piece are 12 inches by 18 inches. This will be 600 dpi. And you can actually see there is a border already put on the piece. This is about a ½ inch border. I have it floating on its own separate layer here. So all the work I'll be doing will be done underneath that. This just gives me a solid border. It'll make it easier for print later on. I wanted to go over the basic, all of my steps from blank canvas to finished piece. Starting with, I'm going to create a new layer, new raster layer, and this will just be for the rough sketch. One thing I would like to keep in mind that I want to have most of the illustration confined to the lower 2/3 of the page. I tend to do that. In many ways, I draw everything assuming it's going to wind up being that it could end up being the cover for a book, for a magazine, things like that. Leaving the image at full size here on the screen so that I can see all of it simultaneously. But then when I want to do tighter details, I'll start zooming in and move the canvas around a whole lot more. And start with the head of the main character. I do have a model reference open on another screen. This is a reference of one of the models that I work with, my friend Amber. We've done quite a few pieces together. As much as I have that sitting open, however, I'm going to be changing aspects of that original photo. I want to move it in space a little bit, change some of the angles, and I tend to do that a lot. Even if you work with model references, you still want to have a really good working knowledge of anatomy for precisely this idea that you can go in and change things to better match your idea. My idea was of this robotic demon figure examining essentially the very first computer chip. But I'm putting in this very rough, this design that will end up being underneath the main figure to compose it, everything I need to construct the figure. And in this case, she's looking directly at this chip, which I'm just putting on a very rough rectangle at the moment to indicate what that would end up being. But this is the primary relationship, the primary story happening in the illustration. So I want to make sure the focus for this entire piece is on that. But I don't want to minimize the other elements in the illustration. I want to make sure the character herself still looks compelling, the background, the setting this will all be taking place in still looks interesting, it still looks vibrant, there is a story there as well. The main focus is always going to be this relationship, her eye line to this computer chip. Create another raster layer, spending a bit more time actually detailing the figure, putting in not necessarily the final design, but I keep wanting to build up to that. I tend to redraw my figures a few times to build up to what the final design I want would end up being. And I want to really nail down the character in the eyes. I want to make sure that as much as she's going to be this robot figure, the face will still have a lot of human characteristics. I will be giving her a hairstyle, but giving her long hair, but I want to just leave that for now until I get a bit more of the overall construction completed. Now I'm putting in an awful lot of line art for an illustration in which you won't see any line art, but that's really just to help me define the shapes when I go to paint it, to help me define define the bone structure, that I don't lose track of what the figure looks like underneath. Now, even though large sections of this robot demon design are actually going to be a glass robot with the mechanical structure visible through the glass. It's still based on human anatomy. So I want to follow the structures of human anatomy as much as possible. Plus, this lets me decide on lighting a little bit early in the design. The most important part of any figure illustration is actually the face, and most specifically the eyes. So I want to make sure I really nail that design first. And there's already a couple things here that I want to tweak a bit. Now that I have that done, there's another element that I'm wanting to change. I want to actually have her arm and hand pulled a little bit closer to her, pulled a little bit closer to her eyes, and kind of emphasize how her hand is bent back. At first, this computer chip design won't really look all that much like a computer chip. Honestly, the final version won't really look that much like a modern computer chip either. The very first design, the first, IC, integrated circuit, was a very wobbly looking thing, barely recognizable as to something we would think of as a computer chip. But I'm hoping as it develops and as I have wires coming down that are connecting to it, coming down to wrap around her arm, it'll be a bit more obvious. But when possible, I start by drawing from life and drawing from, I work from photo references, from references that I've taken. I had this posted on all of my social media, my Hey Cafe, my Blue Sky page, all that. I do not do any work from AI. As much as I do an awful lot of illustrations of robots and robotic figures, AI is not involved in the creation of any of my pieces in any way whatsoever. Now, the design of the machinery on her lower torso is fairly similar to machinery patterns I've done on my robot designs for the past decade or so. I've come up with a rough pattern that I quite like working with. I do tend to vary it a little bit from project to project, and with this one, because I am blending both my glass robot design along with my more regular cyberpunky, aggressive design aesthetics, I'm actually changing the robot pattern a bit more than what I normally do, but I think that will work really well for the look that I'm going for. Now, one thing I want to do with this is also have it look like she's kind of emerging out of the setting. Now, I would still consider all of this to still be the rough sketch portion of the illustration. I'm still developing the concept as I'm working on it here. I'm giving myself plenty of leeway for inspiration. Part of what I want to deal with is going along with the circular shape of the halo behind her and this cable running. Actually, I'll have even more of them. These wires coming down from this particular chip. I want to reinforce that curving circular feeling into the entire piece, end up creating these spiraling patterns all the way around her as part of the design language of this particular composition. Now again, this line art will not be in the final version of the illustration. It'll just be a guide for when I start painting. It'll be a good reminder, good way to help me separate planes. It can be very easy to get caught up in working on small details in the background and on certain elements of an illustration to the point where those secondary portions, the backgrounds, things that are not important to the story, they're not integral to the story, can end up having a bit too much focus because you're having too much fun, putting in all this hyper detail on certain things. And if that's what you wanted to do, that's fine. But if your intent was being about the main character, you can run the risk of losing all that by hyper focusing. Now, this is not yet the final design. This is still tinkering with the rough sketch I pretty much have the overall composition laid down. The placement of the figure in space, things like that. I still have a lot of room for interpretation. I still want to consider this one of my early sketch phases. Now you can see it's almost forming a horizon line behind her. It's getting pretty close to doing something like that. Then I want to have maybe some structures coming up, getting a little bit of verticality. All right, so at this point, I have the overall design roughed out. I see the various planes, the various elements that I want to play with. I would still like to do one more pass, sketching out ideas, and then I can, as well as bringing in a few individual ideas um, that I haven't touched on yet. Like I could have hanging cables behind her, much thicker ones than just the wires coming from the computer chip, but things like bundles of cables from the ceiling above her, arcing down into in the horizontal space that she's inhabiting and growing out of, to further tie everything in together. I want to play with figuring out the lighting pattern. Now, there's a lot of people that work digitally that will do all of the work in black and white, and then they'll color tint all that shading. But that's not what I'm wanting to do. I do want to do a grayscale lighting pattern. That's more just to get a feel for how I want to end up painting it later. So, new raster layer behind everything else. I'm going to drop the opacity down fairly low and really increase my brush size. Now, I do have a pretty solid idea of the basic lighting on the figure. That one lighting pattern would be essentially coming from this chip. I may end up wanting to drop the opacity of this painting layer a bit more. With the basic sketch now done, my basic composition is more or less completed. I may end up changing things on it a little bit later. But right now, I'm overall happy with how this sketch looks, and I want to go ahead and start assembling the piece, laying down flat color layers so I can actually start painting it. Because as much detail is in here, none of this artwork will appear in the final illustration. I made a copy of the finished piece, and I'm now just having it sitting open on the tablet right beside it, just so I can constantly check back and see what the original intent was. Because I will be turning off these layers periodically. Right now, I'm going to drop down the opacity really, really low on both of my sketching layers. So that my idea here is that I'm going to be filling in a flat color layer. Basically, I'm going to put down a flat color for each section of the illustration that I want to paint. Now, generally, this color I'll be putting down right now won't represent the final color that I'll be using to do the final painting with. It's just a holding color. Those layers will be locked. Basically, I'll paint a shape, or I'll select a shape for that layer, and I'll only be able to paint within that shape I'd created. The basic background, I'm just going to drop in a super light blue, but then create a new raster layer. I have the deep background assembled, set up so that there's this kind of horizon line of the skulls and machinery and stuff. So everything that's past those skulls, that's going to be on the furthest background layer. All right, so on this second layer, let's switch over to a slightly darker purple. Using the lasso tool, I'm just going to select everything where those skulls and machines and such are behind her, and figure out the basic shapes of what I want. They're not going to line up because the sketches, the sketch skulls are so sketched. Really going to worry about following that design too closely. Instead, it'll just be roughly what I'd put down. I see what my intent was, see what I can do with it a little bit later. This gives me a lot of opportunity to freehand paint something. Now the basic horizon line and everything below that is on its own separate layer. I'm going to lock that layer. So now if I was to take a paintbrush and grab, say, a red or something and start painting somewhere in here, went outside that selection, it doesn't do anything. It only paints over the purple, nothing else. Now I'm going to create another background layer. I'm not going to, in some of my previous videos, I've put in just dozens of different background layers for this sort of painting. For this one, because the color scheme on all of them is going to be fairly similar, I'm actually not going to use too many of those background painting layers. I'll just basically try to work freehand on separating all the various skulls. But I do want to create a separate background layer, the background that she's kind of coming out of. Now, again, these colors I'm choosing won't represent the colors I'll be using to paint the piece with. There's holding colors for now. When I do my composition, I tend to work from front to back. I talk about this in many of my videos. I start by focusing on the major story elements, the major character, things like that, and then work back to the deepest background. When I do when I switch over to do painting on one of these style illustrations, I work from back to front. I like painting in the deepest background first, moving forward in space to the main character or characters, and that's the same approach I'm going to take with this particular piece, starting with the deep background, what's currently a very light blue. And if you look at the camera footage of the screen tablet, it looks very different than what it looks like in the feed, the direct feed of the digital painting. In real life, it looks much closer to what it is on the screen right now. Let's go ahead and go back down to my furthest background layer, the actual background layer. And not only do I like painting from back to front, I also paint from dark to light. So in this case, I'm going to fill it basically with black. And the basics of color theory for a piece like this are essentially whatever is furthest away from the viewer will be cooler and less saturated. So shifting towards blue, and there'll be a lot less intense color. Anything closer to the viewer is warmer and more saturated, shifting towards reds and oranges with a lot more rich colors. And that is very much what I'm going to be doing with this particular piece. With the deep background, I just started with a flat black, and I'm going to be painting in some blues, a little bit of neutral grays, things like that to start with, and then start hand painting the various details. So start with a very cool gray. I'm going to keep the initial sketch open beside this so I can see the rough details that I'm wanting to paint into here. But I also have a lot of room for interpretation. You know what, I'm going to try and make that grad a bit bigger. And I still have all the line art available as a separate layer on here if I want to consult that. For right now, I am just going to stick with just freehanding it, putting in a basic pattern. I want to create a structure in the background, kind of like the interior of a dome, since that very much lines up with what my original sketch had been. Now that I have a very simple pattern in that deep background, basic color pattern showing light coming up from below, now I want to rough in basic details of the background. And then once I have that all roughed in, I can go in and start putting in more detail, pick out specific objects. So with this method, I'm basically having working from dark to light. It's like I'm having the background kind of emerge, kind of come up out of the shadows. Up until now, the background coloring has been fairly uniform in that it's all been shades of this cool gray, skewing a little bit towards green. But now I'm adding in a bit more of a blue light to give it a bit more depth, indicate a little bit more complexity, a little bit more variation in not just the direction that light is coming from, but the kind of light. This will keep the background from being a little bit too flat. Fill all that in with the darkest possible color, and then start, well, basically working from dark to light, start painting in lighter colors as I go. I'm using the airbrush tool to create a light pattern that lines up roughly with all of the skulls that will be in this particular layer as I laid them out in the initial sketch, just to give me a rough idea of where I'm going to be painting those designs. While I do have that line art on this particular file, I'm gonna not worry about looking at it too much. I'll just keep consulting the sketch beside me. And so now you can see the shapes of these skulls starting to emerge from this middle ground. Once I get to see the actual shapes I want, I'll be able to carry that all the way through all the various elements on the same layer. And now grabbing some of this, some of the blue elements from the background that I didn't do a lot of, but I still wanted to have a bit of a secondary color back there. Pulling those forward into these skulls to still tie everything together, into the skulls and machinery. To tie everything together to make it look like it's all part of the same environment. But I want to deal with some slightly warmer colors, probably more of a neutral color coming from the lower right, just to give a bit more depth to the setting and to help separate the planes. Like very much, this will end up mirrored in the fact that the central character is going to be a lot warmer, in that she's going to have this internal reddish glow. So I want to reflect that a little bit in the environment. Now, I'll deal more with that when I've actually painted her, so it's easier to see what those colors would end up being. I'll deal with a little bit of basically a neutral color, add in a bit of it here, and then I can start just grabbing samples of the color. Here we go. For the painting. This will add a little bit of depth, a little bit more scale, this whole setting. I went ahead and jumped ahead a little bit. I was working on the bodysuit using very much the same colors and techniques that I used for the background. Added in the hair already. Right now the hair is a fairly vibrant red. a vibrant, if dark, red. I'm probably still going to end up tweaking that a bit, depending on the colors I go with on the main figure, and how much light that particular glass robot construction is casting. So I may end up wanting to mute the hair a little bit to make any red coming up being reflected from the body into it a little bit more dramatic. And just gonna tweak that hair color a little bit. Now later on I'll be touching it up again. Like I said, once I get the colors completed, the painting completed in the main figure. Although the halo I did behind her, right now I have that as being a very vibrant red, pretty much the same as what I started with on the hair. I also changed the wires that are coming off of the chip that she's holding in her hand. I changed those to black already and added a little bit of highlights here and there just to show them separating in space from each other. Given that the figure is going to be glass, the main thing I want to do start with is essentially paint everything behind the character, through her body, and curving everything to match how light bends as it travels through curved glass. I've done this technique quite a few times. I did a few different series of glass robots in the past. Like with all the previous layers, first thing I do is fill it with black, with the darkest color. And I'm going to start with the torso and arm. And once I do the first pass on that, then I'll start working on the head as well, but still treat them as two separate layers the whole way through. And grab background color to grad in using the airbrush tool. Gradually build in the shapes and the light from behind her. This is just laying down the basic color pattern. Now that I've got that basic under structure uh, put in for the figure, I'm going to try the first pass of doing actually some internal wiring and veins and things like that, some sort of internal structure. And it'll give me even more form and design to add reflections over top of later to really make the glass reflections stand out. And this layer is set to screen so that I can paint in this dark red, and it basically just strips away everything underneath that isn't red. And now starting to add in a bit of a side light from the left side of frame, really bring home that notion of it being a glass reflective surface. want to add a little bit more of a neutral color coming from the right of frame. And I think I want to bring in a little bit of the blue from behind everything. Actually have that wrap around being bounced off the environment back onto her, just to give it a little bit more visual interest. This will go a long way to reinforce just how reflective the glass surface of her body is. Again, starting the very dark color. And I'm establishing much of the red is both an internal glow on her, but also coming from this chip. I'm going to add a bit of a punchy glow behind that chip, like it's actually emitting some sort of energy. I want to add some final polishing, some final special effects. I'm going to add a layer on top of everything else I've done so far. It'll be another screen layer. I might do a couple of these because I want to start with the red lighting on the main character. And there we go. So the main character is now completed. All the various layers are added in. My final special effects layer to give everything a little bit of a polish has been added. You can see that the main character is primarily warm tones, and she definitely pops out of the rest of the setting. The setting consisting of much cooler bluish tones in the deep background, going to a warmer gray in the foreground, but still never becoming a more saturated color than she ends up being. So the focus is always pushed towards the main character, and in particular her relationship looking at this particular chip that she is holding. Thank you very much for hanging out and watching this, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.